Well, welcome to another edition of Traveling Through History. Today we get to look at a really fascinating piece of history. This is around a stone that was found in Egypt in 1799 by Napoleon and his men while they were conquering Egypt at the time. And they were actually in the process of reinforcing an Ottoman fort for their own purposes, and unearthed this stone out of the ground and took a look at it and immediately knew that it was very important. They noticed that it had several different languages inscribed on it. One of them being ancient Greek, which they recognized, and started realizing that this stone might be really, really important for the future of language recognition. And so they took it and eventually presented it to Napoleon himself, and it became a very important find as part of their expedition to Egypt during those couple of years. 1799 being a very important time when Napoleon was expanding his empire. So as you can see, this stone has been looked at and studied and translated over the many, many years since. It has changed hands multiple times. Currently, the English have it in the English Museum in London. And it is a stone you can actually go see yourself if you want to go to the English Museum. It's really a fascinating exposition. I've actually gone to see it myself. It has been a number of years since I've gone to see it, so I would like to go return and see it again. But today we're going to go into the history of the stone, how it was found, what happened to it when it changed hands, and also who were the people who translated it. And finally, we're able to figure out exactly what hieroglyphs meant when they looked at the old Egyptian ancient language that had died out. We now can read hieroglyphs because of this stone, because of the translation abilities it has. So we'll go into all those facts, and we'll talk about some interesting facts from the actual stone itself and from the history of it. So let's go ahead and get into the history of the Rosetta Stone. So the Rosetta Stone is a dark-colored granodiorite stele, or a stone, inscribed with the same text in three different scripts. The first script is Demotic, which was an ancient Egyptian language, hieroglyphic, another ancient Egyptian language, and ancient Greek. In July 1799, the stone was found in the city of Rosetta, which is modern-day El Rashid, by French soldiers during Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. Rosetta was located in the tributary of the Nile near the Mediterranean coast, near the city of Alexandria. Napoleon's forces were constructing fortifications when the large inscribed stone fragment was uncovered by officer Pierre-François Xavier Bouchard. He immediately recognized the significance of the Greek and hieroglyphic scripts, predicting correctly that each script represented a translation of a single text. The guess was corroborated upon translating the Greek description of how the stela's text was to be promulgated. The decree shall be inscribed on a stela of hard stone in sacred hieroglyphic, native Demotic, and Greek characters. Thus, the Rosetta Stone, or in French, the Stone of Rosetta, was named after the city where it was discovered. Since initially unearthed, the Rosetta Stone has become an international icon whose kaleidoscopic symbolism was appropriated by diverse groups over the last 2 centuries. Its current residence is in the British Museum, and it's a legacy of imperial ambitions of France and England in their struggle to establish, maintain, and extend colonial empires in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The stone itself still bears the marks of these conflicts, as texts painted on the sides declare captured in Egypt by British Army in 1801 and presented by King George III of England. Egypt, at the time part of the Ottoman Empire, found itself pinned between competing political powers, France and England. Napoleon's invasion in 1798 and his subsequent defeat by British and Ottoman forces in 1801 led Egypt into a century often characterized as exploitation. Repression of independent development by European powers led to mass protest, widespread resistance, and periodic revolt in Egypt, frequently mobilizing around nationalist sentiments among the predominantly Islamic and Coptic populations. The stone was officially turned over to the British in the Treaty of Alexandria in 1801, then accession to the British Museum in 1802. There, under registration of BMEA24, it has remained an almost continuous display ever since. The historical context is crucial for understanding how various communities have shaped the meaning of the Rosetta Stone. For Napoleon soldiers who discovered the stone, as well as British soldiers who confiscated it after the French defeat, the stone represented political hegemony and scientific discovery. For many groups of Egyptians, the stone has been regarded as an emblem of a shared cultural national heritage. As such, some individuals have framed the export of the Rosetta Stone as colonial theft that should be assuaged through the repatriation of modern Egyptian state. Its crucial role in deciphering ancient Egyptian scripts has led to the proliferation of the term Rosetta Stone as a generic reference to anything that decodes, ciphers, or reveals hidden mysteries. So isn't that interesting that when you say the term Rosetta Stone now, it's become a generic term for translating or decoding ancient languages. The business community has eagerly capitalized on its popularity, best represented by the adoption of the moniker for successful language learning software, Rosetta Stone, which you may know today. It's so ubiquitous in the 21st century global culture that future generations may one day use the phrase Rosetta Stone without understanding its origin is in the chance discovery of a remarkable looking rock in Egypt. As scholars embarked on serious attempts to decode the Egyptian scripts with the help of the Greek translation on the stone, the trilingual nature of the inscription on the Rosetta Stone set off a decipherment frenzy in Europe. Although popular imagination connects the Rosetta Stone most immediately to the Egyptian hieroglyphic script at the top, the first significant steps towards decipherment focused on the Demotic inscription, since it was the best preserved of the Egyptian versions. So you can imagine the people who were translating this stone initially, the British and the French, they knew ancient Greek and they knew Demotic. So they were able to translate the bottom of the stone and the middle of the stone relatively easily. It was the top of the stone, the hieroglyphs, that took them the longest to do. These developments set stage for the now infamous rivalry between Thomas Young of England and Jean-François Compagnon in the race to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs between England and France. Both men were brilliant. Young, the elder by 17 years, made incredible progress with both the hieroglyphic and Demotic scripts, but it was Compagnon who was the final breakthrough. Compagnon had dedicated his intellectual efforts since childhood to ancient Egypt and Egyptography, and studied Coptic under Sylvestre de Sacy. These efforts paid off when Compagnon confirmed the hypothesis that Egyptian hieroglyphs indicated phonetic sounds, using his knowledge of Coptic to correctly deduce the reading of hieroglyphic writing of the word to give birth. That was the word that was the breakthrough, to give birth. At this moment, he became the first person in well over a millennium to read the cartouches of Ramses and Thutmoses in their original language. In a legend recounted by Champagnon's nephew, upon recognizing the significance of this confirmation, Champagnon burst into his brother's office and he shouted, "I've got it." And then he fainted, remaining unconscious for nearly a week. With the exceptional feat, Champagnon established himself as father of Egyptology, embedding the Rosetta Stone into the birth of the new discipline. So this has become, of course, a huge industry now, but Champagnon and Young from England were the two that were translating the stone initially and really started this whole industry. With the mysteries of the Egyptian script unlocked by Champagnon and his successors, scholars were able to confirm the Rosetta Stone represented three translations of the same single text. The context of that text, already known from the Greek version, was a decree in the name of King Ptolemy V Epiphanes. On March 27th, 196 BCE, a synod of priests from around Egypt convened to celebrate the coronation of Ptolemy V, the previous day in the city of Memphis, the traditional capital of Egypt. At that time, Memphis had been eclipsed economically by Alexandria, on the Mediterranean coast, but the city remained the important symbolic link of the pharaoh's past. The royal edict stemming from this meeting was circulated on stelae throughout the country, very similar to this stone. As the congregation and coronation took place in Memphis, the text on the Rosetta stone, therefore became the stone itself, is often referred to as the Memphis Decree. The decree is attested on several other stelae from Elephatine and Tel Ayuda, while select passages are paralleled on a stela in Nobarai. At the time the decree was written in 196 BCE, the king was just 13 years old, a teenager who had received the crown at a very difficult moment in history in the Ptolemaic dynasty. The reign of Ptolemy IV, his father, ended with widespread revolt throughout Egypt, including the establishment of short-lived dynasty of native kings in Upper Egypt after 206 BCE. Part of the decree preserved the Rosetta Stone celebrates Ptolemy V's quelling of the delta portion of this rebellion and his supposed siege of the city of Lycropolis. Archaeological excavations at the site of Tel Tamai show evidence of disturbance and disruption during this time, which the excavators have associated with the Ptolemaic suppression of these revolts. Although the young king inherited the throne at the death of his father in 204 BCE, he had taken the diadem of rulership as a toddler under the supervision of scheming regents, who quickly arranged for the murder of the queen and leaving the young boy without a mother or a family regent. As a child, Ptolemy V was crowned by the regents in the palace, but his official coronation was delayed for 9 years until he grew older. This later coronation is the celebration cause of the Memphis decree on the Rosetta Stone. So very interestingly, as you see there, he took the crown at a very young age, around 5 years old, but was not truly crowned in a public way until he was 12. And then, of course, this decree came when he was 13. Although the Delta resistance was defeated, according to the text on the Rosetta Stone, the Upper Egyptian rebels held out until 186 BCE, when royal sovereignty over the region was restored by Ptolemy V. The decree itself is a complex document attesting to the negotiation of authority between two powerful groups, the royal house of the Ptolemies and the collected associations of Egyptian priests. Very interestingly, if you think about it, Ptolemy IV and Ptolemy V were actually Greeks, and they were Greeks that were ruling in Egypt. And so there were very powerful forces that were very opposed to the Ptolemies and opposed to their rule. They wanted Egyptians to rule. In the stone's text, Ptolemy V is presented as a beneficent ruler who will renew financial support for the temples, increase priestly stipends, reduce taxes, offer amnesty for prisoners, and sponsor prominent animal cults. In return, the royal cult will be reaffirmed through the statues called Ptolemy, Protector of Egypt, erected in temples throughout the land. The priests are to tend to the statues 3 times daily and to celebrate the holiday of the king's birth on a monthly basis. The king's authority is therefore continually reaffirmed, while material benefits are conferred on the Egyptian religious administrations. Similar imperial pronouncements are attested on other stelae, often called Ptolemaic sacerdotal decrees, a context into which Memphis decree on the Rosetta Stone must be understood. Famous examples of sacerdotal decrees include the Mendes Stela of 264, the Alexandrian decree of 243 BCE, the Canopius decree of 238, the Raphia decree of 217, the Memphis decree of the Rosetta Stone in 196. So you can see there was a series of about 6 major decrees over about a 100-year period. New fragments of such stela continue to be discovered in archaeological excavations all around Egypt, including a new example of the Alexandrian decree from El Karzaya found in 1999, so very recently, and fragments of the Canopus decree in Tel Basta found in 2004. So you can see they're still finding stones very similar to this one, smaller but little pieces and fragments all over Egypt. and still trying to find ways to decipher and decode those decrees so they can see what they say. So really, really fascinating if you can imagine the discovery of the stone by the French troops who reported Napoleon. Then the British took it over in 1801, returned it to England in 1802, put it into the museum where it's been ever since, except for a very short time that it actually was taken out of the museum for protection during World War I. So that's a little bit of interesting history behind the Rosetta Stone and the fascinating impact it's had on our study of ancient languages and Egyptian history. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at a series of videos, and we'll come back and talk about those on the other side.
Have you ever heard of Rosetta Stone? No, we're not talking about a language teaching software, but the Rosetta Stone that the software was named after. It is an actual historical artifact that revolutionized understanding of ancient languages like never before. The Rosetta Stone serves as an important resource and tool dating to the 2nd century BCE. The story behind the Rosetta Stone, its discovery, and its place in history includes some unlikely figures, a bit of controversy, and some impressive code cracking. At the time, no one grasped the importance of the large stone slab. During the 19th century, linguists used the Rosetta Stone to do what had previously been impossible: read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. In 1798, Napoleon launched a campaign into Egypt. Egypt, nominally under the authority of the Ottoman Empire, was led by Islamic Mamluks, former slave soldiers who established an independent dynasty in Egypt and Syria during the 13th century. Upon arrival, somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 French fighters captured Alexandria before pushing on to Cairo. As French forces traversed the Egyptian deserts, the British Navy attacked the French fleet in the Mediterranean, and Mamluk troops attempted to fight back against the French invasion. Almost 200 technical experts, or savants, from France traveled to Egypt. Intrigued by Egyptian culture, they benefited from the efforts of French soldiers when they happened upon an engraved stone slab near the port city of Rosetta, El Rashid, in July 1799. More or less a happy accident, the find was credited to French General Baron Bouchard, but it could have been found by any of the men demolishing the temple wall it had been built into. To his credit, Bouchard recognized its importance and sent the stone to Cairo. It was then examined by savants and Napoleon himself, who, in order to satisfy the curiosity of the literati in every country, gave orders to have the inscription engraved immediately. Basically, he wanted copies made for the international smarty pants community, in part for them, but also to broadcast his really cool trophy. Finding the Rosetta Stone was one thing, but determining its initial content was another. As a stele, or stone erected as a monument, the Rosetta Stone was made out of granodiorite. Nearly 4 feet tall, just over 2.5 feet wide, and 11 inches thick, the stone weighed 1,680 pounds. Although the stone was damaged, there were 3 distinct passages written in 3 different scripts identified on its surface. Because parts of the top and the bottom are both missing, none of the 3 passages were complete. From the outset, it was believed, correctly, that they all contained the same message. French savants quickly identified that one of the scripts on the stone was ancient Greek. Greek is an Indo-European language still in use today, but has undergone continued changes over more than 34 centuries. It's alphabetic, and even its most ancient dialects are readable and translatable. Jean-Joseph Marcel and Rémy Réage, in their initial assessment, determined that one of the 2 remaining scripts on the Rosetta Stone was Demotic, a cursive writing style used to produce business and legal documents in ancient Egypt. Demotic was made up of symbols that represented ideas and sounds and was accessible to commoners. Unfortunately, they couldn't read Demotic. Marcel and Réage made a print of the text and sent it to Europe, where scholars were making gains in this area, however. They benefited from the Rosetta Stone, comparing the Greek section to the Demotic one, slowly deciphering the unknown language. The third language, hieroglyphic, remained a mystery. Hieroglyphic was the sacred language in ancient Egypt. Similarly made up of symbols called hieroglyphs, hieroglyphics had fallen by the wayside during the 4th century CE. When it was replaced with simpler, more convenient writing styles, knowledge of how to read or write the picture-based language perished. R.I.P. hieroglyphs. As linguists put their all into reading the Rosetta Stone, Napoleon continued his campaigns in Egypt and Syria. It didn't go well. Due to repeated defeats by the British, Napoleon was forced to sign the Treaty of Alexandria in 1801. According to the treaty, the French had to give up their most valuable archaeological treasures, including the Rosetta Stone, to the British. The Rosetta Stone was sent to England via ship, where it arrived at Portsmouth in February 1802. It was then transported to London and held at the British Museum. Comparing the Greek and scripts yielded some exciting results. Names like Ptolemy were deciphered, and scholars identified several letters of the Demotic alphabet. Because many of the Demotic characters were ideograms, symbols that represented ideas, a full reading remained impossible. Englishman Thomas Young built upon the advances of his predecessors, identifying corresponding Demotic and hieroglyphic characters in 1814. Young added 86 symbols to the growing Demotic script. He found Greek and Demotic counterparts, then looked at the third script for their translation. In 1816, Young identified Ptolemy in all three languages. Around the same time, Jean-François Champignon, a French scholar, made comparable advances in understanding the third script. Young and Champignon wrote to one another and shared their findings, but Champignon was able to construct an entire phonetic alphabet of hieroglyphs. He took what he found, assessed other ancient Egypt texts, and more or less deciphered ancient Egyptian grammar and language. Now that is a work of a cunning linguist. Champignon's first published work on hieroglyphs, along with other scholars who preceded him, helped crack the code of hieroglyphic, figurative, ideographic, and alphabetic writing in Egypt. Identifying what the text on the Rosetta Stone said in 1, 2, and then 3 languages meant it was now impossible to venture into the unknown. Previously unreadable ancient Egyptian texts, inscriptions, and artifacts open a whole new world of Egyptian culture rife with possibility. The 3 scripts on the Rosetta Stone help place it in history. Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic were all in use after Egypt fell under the authority of the Ptolemaic dynasty that lasted from roughly 305 to 30 BC. The text of the Rosetta Stone praises one of the rulers of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Ptolemy V, and was erected in 196 BCE. Known as Ptolemy V Epiphanes, the god manifest himself, Ptolemy ruled via regent from 210 to 205 BC and then on his own in 180 BCE. Ptolemy V took the throne as a young child after the death of his parents, married a Syrian princess, and was assassinated in anticipation of starting a war with the Seleucid Empire to the east. According to the Rosetta Stone, Ptolemy quashed revolts, brought prosperity to Egypt, administered justice, and remitted taxes, all the things a good leader should do. The location of the Rosetta Stone has not changed since 1802, except for a brief period when it was moved to an underground postal railway station for its protection during World War I. On full display and open for public viewing, the Rosetta Stone's presence in London is not without controversy. For some, the Rosetta Stone is a symbol through which you can trace Western colonial interest in Egypt. Calls for its return to Egypt continue to arise for decades, but negotiations for even a temporary visit have failed. As plans were unveiled for the Grand Egyptian Museum during the early 2000s, located near the pyramids of Giza, there was renewed hope that the Rosetta Stone might return to its native country.
For centuries, scholars puzzled over the hieroglyphs they found carved onto ancient Egyptian ruins, tablets, and papyri, but a unique discovery would finally help unlock their meaning. In 1799, as the French military invaded Egypt, an officer encountered a curious stone on the outskirts of Rashid, or Rosetta. It was inscribed with 3 different portions of text: Egyptian hieroglyphs, which is the oldest Egyptian script, dating back some 5,000 years, Demotic Egyptian, which is a later derivative of Egyptian, and Ancient Greek. It seemed that each section was a rough translation of the others, meaning the stone presented an unprecedented key to unlocking hieroglyphs. English troops soon intercepted the stone and brought it to the British Museum in 1802, where it became one of the most popular displays. Various European scholars, including Johann Åkerblad, Thomas Young, and Jean-François Champignon, worked to decode the Egyptian scripts. There were some crucial initial clues. The Greek section included the names of royal figures, while certain areas in the Demotic section had bracket-like forms and some hieroglyphic sections were encircled. Could these portions encode the same royal names? Åkerblad matched some characters up and, in 1802, successfully decoded the royal names and some simple words like much and temples in the Demotic script. This led Åkerblad to believe that all Demotic signs were alphabetic, meaning each letter represented a discrete sound, much like in English. Thomas Young, in contrast, suspected that some of the Demotic signs were logograms, that is, symbols encoding entire words or phrases. For example, he believed a sun disk with a stroke indicated the sun or sun god. Around 1814, he deciphered some recurring Demotic words, like Pharaoh and Egypt. Young also had the critical insight that Demotic was a later iteration of hieroglyphs, And studying the hieroglyphic text, Young successfully decoded the royal name Ptolemy, but he still believed the prevailing misconception that most hieroglyphs were logograms representing ideas, not sounds. Using his knowledge of other scripts and languages, like the Egyptian Coptic he learned from a Coptic Christian priest, Champollion realized that most encircled hieroglyphs were phonetic. They represented sounds, the Egyptian vulture, and A, the three fox skins, Mes, and so on. This finally allowed him to read the Egyptian names Ramses and Tutmosis. Cross-referencing other hieroglyphic texts, Champollion confirmed that many hieroglyphs beyond the encircled names were phonetic. And on September 14, 1822, he ran to his brother's house and declared the breakthrough. Later, Champollion determined that, beyond alphabetic and logographic hieroglyphs, some were classifiers that sorted words into categories, like occupations, plants, and abstract concepts. The first complete translation of the Rosetta Stone was finally published in the early 1850s. So, what did it actually say? The inscription was marked 196 BCE. It honored the first anniversary of 13-year-old Pharaoh Ptolemy V's coronation and outlined a series of benefits for the Egyptian priesthood. The inscriptions described laws for maintaining temples and performing rituals, like the burial of sacred animals. At the time, Egypt was a multicultural society. Two main languages were spoken: Ancient Greek, brought by Egypt's conquerors, and Demotic Egyptian, the native language. Hieroglyphs represented Middle Egyptian, a language that was already antiquated but may have been included to convey a sense of authority. The decree was copied onto many stones and erected in temples. However, as regimes shifted, edifices were deconstructed and reconstructed. Some scholars think the Rosetta Stone was originally placed in a temple in Sais. It's unclear how it ended up 80 kilometers away, but it may have been transported up the Nile after the late 15th century. Once deciphered, hieroglyphs helped overturn misconceptions. Subterranean chambers within Egyptian pyramids were once thought to be secret sites of priestly initiation and study, but it was finally confirmed that pyramids were tombs housing sacred preservations for the afterlife. Soon, entire texts could be translated that showcase the complexity of ancient Egyptian religious compositions. Experts are still decoding new hieroglyphs as they arise and untangling instances of tricky grammar and wordplay. The Rosetta Stone helped illuminate one of the world's oldest written languages and the vibrant history it emerged from. And yet, the pillaged artifact remains far from its provenance today. Decoding hieroglyphs allowed scholars to finally translate the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
So you can see so many fascinating things out of that series of videos. The first one being that what kind of stroke of luck it was that these French troops happened upon this incredible find of the Rosetta Stone, essentially a slab of rock that had been inscribed by 3 different languages, allowing Egyptographers, historians, and people who like to study the area to now start to translate some of the ancient languages that had died out, especially hieroglyphics. They had been really stumped with hieroglyphics for many centuries before that. They knew ancient Greek and they had learned Demotic language by looking at Coptic, which they also understood, but hieroglyphs were very much puzzling to them. And this stone allowed them to translate the same text across all 3 languages, now allowing them to understand how hieroglyphs actually worked, the construction of words, that they were phonetic, very similar to English, and that it allowed them to now start translating. And they've been using this type of translation technique ever since. So incredibly important for the unlocking of the ancient world, as you can see. The other thing you can see there was how important the people who discovered it, the French troops at the time, and then the English in 1801 knew that stone was. They knew that this was, in a lot of ways, the key to unlocking the ancient world in Egypt and the ancient cultures that they were trying to discover. As you heard in some of my initial comments, this was a time when Egypt was very much being exploited by European powers, which is very unfortunate. They were going into tombs and they were raiding as much as they could find, in a lot of cases taking things out of there, but not understanding what was written on them. And so this gave them a chance to start to translate what was actually being said in those times. So hopefully you found those videos very interesting and fascinating like I did. Let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of really interesting photos. And also we're going to get into the little known facts about the Rosetta Stone. You see a picture here is a really nice depiction of Napoleon when he came up upon the temples for the first time in Egypt and took a look at the Sphinx without its nose. And this really is a nice portrayal of what was happening at the time in 1798 and 1799 when the French were trying to conquer the country of Egypt. This is the actual depiction of the finding of the stone by Bouchard and his men who were reporting to Napoleon at the time. As you can see, they found it in the ground. They pulled all the dirt back, and then they ended up pulling it out of the ground. It was about 1,000 pounds total. Put it up on a cart and started looking at it and realized immediately that they had found something really, really special. And so, of course, then sent it to Cairo to be looked at even further by the different scholars and other historians they had brought along as part of the expedition from France. And of course, at that time, Napoleon got to take a look at it as well and knew immediately that this was a treasure that should be preserved. This is actually when it got back to Cairo. These are the Frenchmen who got to take a look at it for the first time. Before even Napoleon got to look at it, they started looking at this lab and trying to understand what it said. They could understand the Greek because most of them actually spoke Greek and had translated out of Greek before. They were not as familiar with the other two Egyptian languages, but knew that they had to get this to the lab to take a look at what these languages said. It's really interesting. This is the streets of Cairo. This is a picture of the Rosetta Stone actually in its case today in England. This is what you would see if you went to the British Museum in London to go actually take a look. You can see the three zones on the stone, the bottom being the Greek, the middle portion being the despotic language, which was used at the time. And then the above portion would be the hieroglyphs that were even older. This was an ancient Egyptian language that had already died out. And this is how the historians have looked at the stone and used it as a translation device for the three different zones so that they could determine what they were saying. Really fascinating stuff. This is a picture of Champollion, who was the Frenchman who actually cracked the code. He did rely very heavily upon Young and several others who had made a lot of progress before this, but he was the one that was actually able to crack it. And that's why he ran in to tell his brother about this big event that had happened. So pretty interesting that he had so much time with the stone and was able to put all of his analytical techniques on it and finally did crack the code. Here's another picture of the stone laying down. You can see how big it is and how wide it is, 1,000 pounds, as you can see. You can imagine this was only about half of the original stone that was inscribed, so you can imagine how heavy the original stone would have been with all of its inscriptions. I know historians today would have loved to see the full thing uncracked so they could actually translate all of it. Here's another close-up of what the top of the stone looks like for the hieroglyphs. This is the portion of the translation that was the toughest and took many, many years to figure out what was being said in the old ancient hieroglyphic language. And here's another close-up of the stone. As you can see, the way that they inscribed these three languages on the stone. If you think about the workmanship by the men and women that were doing the inscribing of these stones all over Egypt to actually do the proclamation that Ptolemy V had been crowned king. This amount of work that they had to do and the craftsmanship, the incredible work that they did just with a chisel was really pretty incredible if you think about it. Another close-up of the hieroglyphs and some of the circles around several of the hieroglyphs. They eventually later found out why they were encircling it. That was really to highlight an area of the hieroglyphs and really highlight that that was a king or a very important person they were talking about. In this case, that was Ptolemy they were describing there. All right, let's talk about some of the interesting facts about the Rosetta Stone. Number one, Rosetta Stone is part of a larger display slab or stele that broke apart centuries ago and was likely situated inside the temple near El Rashid or Rosetta, where it was discovered. It was written in 197 BCE. It's a bit of ancient propaganda, officially known as the Memphis Decree, affirming the legitimacy and goodness of then King Ptolemy V, who had assumed the throne at the age of 5 after his parents were murdered in a court conspiracy, and received his official coronation at age 12. Given his youth and swirling turmoil in the empire, Ptolemy probably needed a boost from his priests. He has dedicated to the temple's revenues and money and corn, they wrote on the stone, and has undertaken much outlay to bring Egypt into prosperity. So you can see, even thousands of years ago, propaganda was a big part of politics back then. It's really interesting. It's not just today that we have propaganda. It was very big back then as well. Number two, despite its incomplete state, the Rosetta Stone crucially preserves the three languages from the original stele: hieroglyphics, the sacred script of the empire; Egyptian Demotic, which was the everyday language that everybody used at that time; and Greek, which was the official language under Macedonian-ruled Egypt. And of course, the Greek had conquered Egypt, so that was the official language as well. All three convey the same royal decree, with slight variations, indicating the message was widely read and circulated across Egypt. In modern times, this meant the stone could serve as a translation key, with the Greek portion in particular helping scholars crack the hieroglyphics, which had died out around 4th century after Rome's rulers declared it a pagan art. So really interesting. You can see this really was like a decoder tool for later historians. Number three, many of Egypt's temples were destroyed in the 4th century under Roman Emperor Theodosius I, and for years afterwards, the ruins served as quarries for the country's occupiers. Before the French recovered it in the late 18th century, 1799, as you heard, the immensely valuable Rosetta Stone was part of a wall inside the Ottoman fortress. So we never would have found this stone, except that French were actually demolishing this Ottoman fortress and then going to reinforce it for their own use. So the Rosetta Stone finding was actually a complete stroke of luck. Number four, during the Napoleonic Wars, French forces moved into Egypt with the goal of colonizing the country, while reconstructing portions of the Ottoman fort, which the French renamed Fort Julian. Engineer Pierre-François Bouchard noticed a slab of granite sticking out of the ground. Upon closer inspection, he saw it contain various lines of script. Realizing the value of his find, he informed General Jacques-François Minot, the chief general in Egypt, who just happened to be at the site at the time. Soldiers excavated the stone, and months later it was presented for inspection to none other than Napoleon himself in Cairo. Despite his colonizing aims, Napoleon didn't want to run roughshod over Egypt. He recognized the country's rich history and loads of valuable artifacts. He dispatched dozens of scientists, historians, and other bright minds to North Africa, where they formed a scholarly organization called the Institute of Egypt. Napoleon also instructed soldiers and commanders to be on the lookout for anything valuable, an order that was front of mind for Bouchard when he discovered the stone. So very fortunate that we had a conqueror in Napoleon who actually valued artifacts and was very interested in Egyptian history and informed his troops to be on the lookout for things like this. Number six, after defeating Napoleon's forces at Alexandria in 1801, the British commandeered many of the Egyptian artifacts the French had collected during their occupation, including the Rosetta Stone. General Manu actually tried to claim the stone was part of his personal property, but the English recognized its value and made it transfer a part of the official surrender treaty. So very interesting, the British didn't allow Manu to keep it, but instead knew that this stone was very important and made it part of the deal. Number seven, after the British secured the stone, they took it to London's British Museum in 1802, which had opened as the world's first public national museum. The original location was a 17th century mansion, but the Rosetta Stone and other artifacts soon proved to be too heavy for the home structure and were moved to the current location in South Kensington. And again, you can go to the British Museum even today and go see the Rosetta Stone. I'd highly recommend it. It's a fantastic visit. You should spend some time there at the British Museum. There's a lot of great artifacts. Number eight, for decades, the Rosetta Stone sat uncovered in the museum. Although they were discouraged from doing so, visitors would walk up and touch the stone, often tracing the writing with their fingers, a scenario that would no doubt horrify most modern curators. Eventually, the museum realized this probably wasn't good for the longevity of the artifact and placed it beneath a glass case around 1845. So isn't that incredible that for 43 years, visitors could walk up and actually touch the stone trace their fingers across it and actually feel what it felt like. Really incredible. Not a good idea, of course, for the preservation, but must have been an interesting period for people that went to look at it. Number 9, scholars were able to quickly translate the 54 lines of Greek and 32 lines of Demotic inscribed on the stone. As we said earlier, the scholars who were taking a look at it understood those two languages already. But fully deciphering the 14 lines of hieroglyphics took many years. Part of the problem was a prevailing notion that the hieroglyphics were a symbolic writing system, when in fact they were largely phonetic ones, just like English. British scholar Thomas Young made a major breakthrough when he discovered the significance of the cartouches, which were circles drawn around proper names. He published his findings in 1814. Frenchman Jean-François Champollion took up the mantle and delivered a full translation in 1822. So you can see Thomas Young took about 12 years of analyzing it, and then Champollion took another 8 years or so to complete the translation. From there, further understanding of the Egyptian language and culture had flourished. So this really was, this stone, a miraculous find and a way to unlock the ancient Egyptian past. Number 10, the French Egyptologist Champollion made slow, painstaking progress towards decoding hieroglyphics. One day he had a major breakthrough. A sun symbol, he realized, corresponded to the Egyptian word Ra, or sun, which formed the beginning of Ramses, the name for the sun god. Realizing this meant hieroglyphics was a primarily phonetic language, Champollion raced to the Academy of Inscriptions and Belles Lettres, where his brother worked. "I have it," he supposedly cried upon entering his brother's office, and then he promptly fainted. And as you heard, he fainted at the time and was actually unconscious for a full week after he made this huge discovery. It was so overcoming to him. Number 11, the Rosetta Stone has been on display in the British Museum since 1802 with only one break, towards the end of the First World War in 1917, when the museum was concerned about heavy bombing in London by the Germans. They moved it to safety along with other portable important objects. The iconic object spent the next 2 years in a subway station on the Postal Tube runway, 50 feet below ground at Holborn Station. It's really fascinating that there was 2 years they had to move the stone underground because of all the German bombing in London during World War I. Really fascinating fact. Number 12, after discovering the stone, then losing it, France finally got its chance to host the artifact in 1972. The occasion was the 150th anniversary of the publication of Champollion's letter to M. Dachir, which outlined his translation of the Rosetta Stone's hieroglyphics. Housed at the Louvre Museum in Paris, the stone drew thousands far and wide. Despite rumors that France might just hold on to the Rosetta Stone, the Louvre returned it to the British Museum after 1 month. It's really interesting that France did get a chance to host it at the Louvre for at least a month during that 1972 150th anniversary year. Number 13, because each of the Rosetta Stone's 3 sections is slightly different, and because of the subjective nature of translation in general, there's no single authoritative translation of the royal decree. The inscription on the Rosetta Stone is a decree passed by a council of priests. It is one of a series of affirmations, the royal cult of the 13-year-old Ptolemy V on the first anniversary of his coronation in 196. And what I'll do actually is put down in the description below a link to the actual translation if you'd like to read the whole thing yourself. It's an interesting read, but some of it can get a little bit dull. But it does talk a lot about the proclamation of his coronation and about all the different laws and regulations that he's requesting of the Egyptian clergy. So definitely, if you have an interest, take a look at the read of the official translation. Number 14, in 2003, Egypt requested the return of the Rosetta Stone to its original home, citing the artifact as a key piece of Egyptian cultural identity. Officials, including prominent archaeologist and former Minister of Antiquities Zahi Hawass, continued to press the British Museum in subsequent years. The museum has politely declined each request, but did gift Egypt a full-size replica of the Rosetta Stone in 2005. So that's interesting that this friction continues between Egypt and England. England, of course, wants to hold on to the stone, feels like it's rightfully theirs after they won it in 1801. Did give a full-size replica. Actually, the replica weighs about 100 pounds less than the original. Interestingly enough, there's Zahi Hawass is still a very prominent archaeologist and important person, having been on TV a lot in the United States over the years. My father and his wife Julie actually got to meet him when they went on their tour of Egypt 2 years back, and said he was a very interesting man. Finally, a really nice display here of the Rosetta Stone, as you can see. This is actually a really pretty picture that has actually been framed on many archaeologists and scholars' walls in their offices. Gives you a really good sense for how the stone looks when it's displayed on an official museum display. And really interesting there, as you can see. So hopefully you enjoyed learning a little bit about the Rosetta Stone, a really fascinating find in archaeological and ancient history, 1799, and ever since the Western world has been relying on it very heavily to help us translate old Egyptian language and culture, to understand what was happening at the time, what happened back then. And as more and more discoveries are made, even today, the Rosetta Stone has become the key translating tool for those Egyptologists and ancient historians who are taking a look at all the artifacts that are coming out of Egypt even today. So very interesting history behind the Rosetta Stone, as you can see. If you want to continue learning more about the Rosetta Stone and what was actually on it, I will be posting some information in the description down below. You can learn much more. You can keep digging down this rabbit hole that is just fascinating about this amazing stone. I'm actually looking forward to a second return to the British Museum to go take a look at it. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and we have a lot more content coming your way. We look forward to seeing you next time on Traveling Through History. Hopefully you love history as much as we do. Have a good evening.